Now that we've finished up the basic setup and configuration for our project, let's go ahead and take a look at authentication. For our authentication, we're going to be using Firebase, some reducers similar to Redux, and some server-side extra authentication just to ensure that the user is who they say they are. And we're going to be doing that by verifying the token that's returned by the Firebase client. On the client side, inside of your config folder, create a new file called firebase.ts. This file will be responsible for integrating Firebase into our client-side application. What we're going to do is we're going to run an npm install Firebase, and once we've done that, we don't actually need to install the types because Firebase includes its own type definitions, and those will be sufficient for now. So at the top, we're going to have a couple of imports. We're going to import Firebase from firebase/app. We're going to import our Firebase auth directly. Here you're going to see me import the Firestore, and we're going to go ahead and import our config from our config file. Now, just a side note, the Firestore is if you want to add extra functions from Firestore in the future. This is just how you get it started. Next, we're going to make a const Firebase object, and that's going to be equal to our Firebase import.initializeApp, and we're going to pass in our config.firebase that we set up in an earlier video. Next, we're going to export const providers, and inside of this providers is you're going to be providing any of the social medias you want to include. We're just going to be doing Google, and this is how you do it by importing a Google equal to a new firebase.auth.google auth provider. Finally, you're going to export an object called auth, and that's going to be equal to firebase.auth. And then you're going to export the Firebase object itself. Next, let's go ahead and go to our modules and create an auth.ts file. And we're going to make some functions that we're going to be using specifically for our authentication purposes. So first, at the top of the file, let's go ahead and import Firebase from Firebase. Once we've done that, we're going to create our first function. So let's create an export const, and we're going to name this function sign in with social media. Inside of it, we're going to have a variable that's called provider, and the type of that is going to be a firebase.auth.auth provider. Now, instead of pointing to some brackets with the arrow function, we're going to point directly to a new promise. The promise inside of the chevrons is going to be of type firebase.auth.userCredential. We're going to pass in the standard resolve reject callback function, and inside of this is where we're going to have our logic. We're going to import the auth object from our config.firebase file. And inside of it, we're going to do an auth.signinWith popup, and we're going to pass in our provider. This will pop up Google, Facebook, GitHub, whatever you're using. And then in the then block, we're going to resolve the result. And in the catch block, we are going to reject the error. Next, inside of the context folder, create a user.ts file. This is where our user context is going to go. But right before we do that, we should define the interface for the user first. So let's create a user.ts file in our interfaces folder. At the top of the interface file, we're going to export default interface iUser, and we're going to pass in a couple key values here. We're going to have an underscore ID as a string, a UID as a string, and a name as a string. Also, we're going to export a const object called the default user, and we're going to use this to help populate what a default user should look like. And we're just going to have 3 empty strings for the keys that we define in our user interface. Let's also export a default fire token as an empty string, because the fire token is the other thing we're going to have inside of our user context. And since we don't want to define it in that file, but put it somewhere else, we'll just stick it with the interface for now. Inside of your context file, user.ts, first, let's export the iUser state. We're going to have a user as iUser and a fire token that's a string. Next, we're going to export an interface called iUserActions. And you're going to have a type key, which is going to be either a login or logout. And you could also put something like authenticate if you had an extra function, but we're probably just going to use the login and logout for now. Also, we need a payload when we're using contexts and reducers. So inside of that payload, we're going to need a user, of an iUser, and we're going to need a fire token as a string as well. You could also just define this payload as an iUser state, and it would be the exact same thing. Now that we've defined the state and the actions, let's export a const initial user state, which will be used by our reducer. It's going to be of type iUser state. And inside of it, the user and the fire token are going to be equal to those two default exports that we created in the interface file. After that, go ahead and export a const user reducer. And inside of it, you're going to have a function where there's a state, an iUser state, and the action of the iUser actions. Now, inside this reducer is where you're going to define your login and your logout function, or any other function that you want inside of your type definition. So before I do anything, I create two objects. I create a user and a fire token equal to the payload. Next, we add a switch case, and we switch by the action.type. Then we're going to define two cases, login and logout, and also add the default. Like I said, I'm not going to use an authenticate one or anything extra, but you could just put whatever you want inside the types to define your cases, as I mentioned before. So inside of the login case, we're going to do a local storage.setItem, and we're going to save the fire token. And then we're going to return the user and the fire token as the state. For logout, we're going to do a local storage.removeItem fire token, and then we're going to return the initial user state. So when the user logs out, I just want the default state to be applied. Next, we're going to export an interface called iUser context props. We're going to have a user state, which is equal to an iUser state. And then we're going to have a user dispatch, which is going to be equal to one of React's dispatch functions, which is going to be a react.dispatch. And inside of it, you're going to pass in the iUser actions. Next, you're going to have a const user context, and that's going to be equal to React's create context function. You're going to pass in the iUser context props. And inside of the function, you're going to pass in a default state where the user state is equal to the initial user state. This will get overwritten promptly once we add the dispatch. And then the user dispatch can just be an empty function for now, as we're going to define it inside of our application file. Next, you're going to export the consumer and the provider for our user context, as I'm doing here. And then once you've exported both of those, you can go ahead and export default user context. And that's everything we need to define a user context that uses React's useReducer function. So now inside of the application, we're going to add a few things to check to see if the user is authenticated or not the first time we load up this project. We're going to do this by checking local storage and making sure that our user state and our user dispatch with useReducer are defined properly here. So the first thing we're going to add is a const, and inside of this array, we're going to add user state, user dispatch. We're going to make this equal to React's useReducer function. And inside of it, we're going to pass our user reducer that we defined inside of our context and the initial user state. So the initial user state of the context is going to get overwritten right away with this. Next, we're going to add another state variable, and it's going to be a bool, and it's going to be loading with a setLoading setter function. It will initially be set to true. Now, once you've done this, let's go ahead and maybe add just a little debugging statement here. And we're going to add another state variable, and I'm going to call it auth stage. I'm going to make this a string. And I'm going to use this just to show you what stage of the login process your application is going through. So it's going to initially start by checking local storage for a fire token, and then we're going to go from there. Next, import React's useEffect and create a use effect with an empty dependency array so that it's just triggered when the program starts up only one time. Inside of it, you're going to set a timeout. And the reason we're going to do this is because I want to add small delays so you can see everything happening in motion. So let's add a delay of 1 second or 1,000 milliseconds. And then create a function underneath called check local storage for credentials. And we're going to call this function inside of our set timeout. The reason that we're doing this is we're going to check to see if we have a token in local storage. And if we do, we're going to want to authenticate it against the backend. If it's been a short amount of time, it should still be fine. But if it's been too long, then what's going to happen is we're actually going to log the user out and force them to log in again. So inside of the auth state, inside of the check local storage for credentials, you could set your auth stage to checking credentials. Then we're going to make a fire token equal to local storage.getItem, and it's going to be fire token or whatever you named it inside of the user context. Now you're going to check to see if that fire token is null. If it's null, then what we're going to do is we're going to call that user dispatch, and the type we're going to pass into the object is called logout. And inside the payload, we're just going to pass the initial user state. So very important, what this user dispatch is doing is we're calling one of the functions that we created inside of that reducer, and we're passing in a payload. And that payload is going to apply however we make it apply, depending on the function that we picked. So inside of logout, we're just returning an initial user state anyways. So it doesn't really matter what you pass in here, but pass in the initial user state so you know what it's doing. Inside set auth stage here, maybe put no credentials found, and then set another timeout to stop the loading. So maybe another 1,000 milliseconds or 500 milliseconds, whatever you want, but just enough time so you can see that message in the loading screen. Now, if we do find a fire token, what we're going to do is we're going to eventually validate it with the backend, like I mentioned, but we're not doing that in this video yet. It's going to be in the next one. So inside of this function, we can just put a placeholder for now. What we could do is we can just copy the set timeout and then set an auth stage that says credentials have been found and that we're validating them. Again, we'll come back to this in the next video. Next, I'm going to create an object here that's going to pass our user context values to our entire application, because we're going to wrap this return statement switch inside of a user context provider. Really quick, we're going to add an if loading statement. So if our application is loading, I want to see some sort of loading screen, and that's where we're going to put our auth stage. So now we're going to take a look at how to use this .css that we looked in the other file that we created. And what we're going to do is we're going to import this into our application file. And inside of our components, we're going to create a new loading component. Create an index.tsx file, and now we're going to create a few things inside of here to add a nice looking loading component with those cool dots that we found in the first video. So at the top, we're going to import React from React as we normally do. And we're going to give an interface called iLoadingProps. Now inside of this, we're going to have a dot type that is optional, and it's going to be of type string. Next, we're going to create the loading React function component. This is not actually going to be the card that loads, rather just the dots loading themselves. This file is actually going to contain two components, and the second component is going to leverage this one. So export a const loading React function component with the iLoadingProps, and inside of it, you're going to create a const object that is equal to props, and you're going to pass in your children and your dot type. You're going to return, and inside of this return, we're going to add a couple things. We're going to add a div, and the class name we're going to put is text center because we want everything to be standard on the inside. The next div is going to have the class name stage. As we discussed before, this is the holder for the dots. And then we're going to have a div with the class name equal to the dot type. And this is actually what's going to have our loading dots. After that second div, you're going to pass in the children. Next, you're going to have loading.defaultProps. And what this is going to do is always inject some sort of default props into our loading props, even though they're optional, so that you don't have to put them. It'll just go with this default type. And we're just going to use .bricks. You can use any of the .dash and then CSS that was there before. Now that we've created the inner loading React function component, now we're going to create its parent, and it's going to be called loading component. So we're going to have to make some props for this one as well. and you can call these iLoading component props. Inside of it, we're going to have a card that's an optional bool and a dot type that's an optional string. Inside of this React function component, we can just copy and paste the loading component before and rename it. And inside of the return function, after adding card to the props, we can put a card with a card body. Inside of the card body, we can pass in the loading child component that we made above and pass in the dot type. Then once we do that, we can pass in the children on the inside. Now you'll notice before that we put this card variable inside of the props. So if we have a card, this return statement will go in here. If not, what we're going to do is just return that child loading component that we made above. Now, the reason that these components are separated out and they're not one is because you might want to use or add to this parent loading component. So I wanted to keep them separate to show you how you could use two things at once. The loading component is also going to have some default props. And inside of it, the card is always going to be true, and the dot type can be bricks here as well. Once you add the default props, you can export default loading component. Now, we're going to create one more component called centerpiece. And what this is going to do is going to vertically center and horizontally center a card that you want to see in the middle of the screen. So you can either copy and paste your loading component before and replace everything on the inside, or you can write it from scratch. For this component, what we're going to need is the iCenterpiece props. These are going to be empty for now. And a centerpiece React function component. And inside of it, you're going to have a const props, and inside of it, the children. Now, this is going to return a container. This container will be fluid, and it's going to have the class name of p-0, which means we don't want any padding. Inside of that container, we're going to have another container. And that second container is going to pass in its children props. Now, this inner container is going to have a class name as well, and that's going to be equal to d-flex, which is direction flex, and justify content center. And this is Bootstrap's way of helping to center everything inside for you. You're also going to have a style that has a position of absolute, a left of 50%, a top of 50%, a transform, and inside of that transform, you're going to have a translate of minus 50%, minus 50%. And this is React's/HTML's coordinate system here. And then a WebKit transform of the exact same thing. And last but not least, we're going to export default centerpiece. And now we have a nice little object that's going to hold our loading component for us. I know this is a lot for all of the Bootstrap to go through, but once you see it inside, it's going to look really, really nice. So inside of our loading component, you can go ahead and add the centerpiece outside of the card. So that's about it for our loading component and our centerpiece. So here back in the application file, just return a loading component, and inside of it, let's pass the auth stage to it. Inside of the actual return function, you're going to add the user context provider, pass the value user context values that we defined above our loading block, and then wrap the switch inside of this context provider. Now there's one last component we're going to make, and it's called our auth route. What the auth route is going to do is going to protect certain routes to people that aren't logged in. So how we're going to do that is we're going to go to the components folder and create a new folder called auth route. And inside of it, one more time, we're going to create an index.tsx file. Inside of it, we're going to have an interface and a function component. We're going to call this one iAuth route props for the interface. And the function component is going to be the auth route. It's going to have no props on the inside. And inside of the function component, again, just define the children from the props. You're also going to define the user context from React's useContext function, and you're going to pass in the user context that you defined in your context file. Now we're going to check to see if the user context's state.user.id is equal to an empty string. We know that this is the initial user state, therefore the user is not logged in. And an even better way to define that is change that user context to a brackets with a user inside, and then add the user state to the end of the useContext function. This is just a shorthand way of writing it. So if the user.id is empty, we know that the user is not authenticated. So here you can log it and say, unauthenticated redirecting or something along those lines. Then you can return a React Router DOM redirect to the login page. Now put an else statement and just say, if we are logged in, return just a React fragment here and pass in the children. That way the auth route is protected and will be passed in properly. Then back in the application page, modify what's inside of your switch to say if the root.auth is true, then what we're going to do is we're going to render this route, but we're going to wrap it inside of our auth component. That way it's always going to be protected. Now that we've finished up there, let's go ahead and finally create the login page itself. Go ahead and select the login page that we've already created from the pages folder. And inside of it, let's start modifying the page. We're going to have a couple state variables. The first one's going to be authenticating, and this one's going to be of type bool. This is going to let us know when we're actually calling the authentication or not. The default is going to be false. Next, we're going to have an error and set error, and this is going to be a string. You can make this empty to start. Next, let's get a copy of our user context in here, and we're going to use context, the user context that we created before. Also, we're going to want the history object from React Router's useHistory. Next, we're going to make a little variable called isLogin, and this is going to be equal to window.location.pathname. And we're going to check to see if the path name includes login or not. And this is going to be for checking to see if we're either on the register or login page. Both those links are going to redirect here because we're only going to be using social media logins. So depending on if it's a login or create account, basically it's just going to say create account with Google or login with Google. Nice and simple. Next, we're going to create a function, and it's going to be called sign in with social media. We're going to pass in a provider, and similar to what we had inside of our auth modules folder, the provider is going to be provided to us by importing Firebase and then calling the provider as a firebase.auth.auth provider. Inside of it, we're going to check to see if we have an error, and if there is an error, we're just going to set that to empty for now. Next, we're going to set authenticating to true. Then at the top, we're going to import the sign in with social media from our modules auth. Now, you'll remember that this actually has the same name as the function that we're creating right now. So what you can do is you can just import that function as and then give it another name. I'm going to give it the social media pop-up name. Once we've done that, go back inside your sign in with social media function, and let's get started by calling the social media pop-up that we just imported. Inside of it, you're going to pass in the provider, and then you're going to add a then and catch block as we do for a lot of our async functions. Inside of the end, we're going to return a result. Inside of that, let's go ahead and just log the result for now. This result should have all of our Firebase information inside of it. Inside of the then block still, we're going to let the user be equal to a result.user. We're going to check to see if the user exists and have a block in case it doesn't. If the user does exist, we're going to capture that user's user ID, and we're going to capture the name as the user.displayname. Now, I'm using Google, so it's almost guaranteed that this display name will have something inside of it. However, if you're using other social medias like GitHub or Facebook or Twitter, whatever you're going to want this person's name to be, you're going to have a more complicated check here. But for now, I'm just going to use the display name because I know that the accounts I'm going to be using are going to have that display name inside of it. So let's check to see though, just in case the name exists or not. If it does, I'm going to add a try catch block here. And I'm going to let the fire token be equal to our await user.getID token. Now you might get a little error here saying that the function is not async. You can simply just add async and some brackets here at the top and that'll fix that for you. Now, if we do get a token, what we're going to do is we're going to authenticate with the backend. And if we don't get a token or there's some sort of error, we're going to fail out. For now, I'm just going to leave that little comment here as a placeholder. I'm going to set the error to invalid token, log the error, and set authenticating to false. If the name doesn't exist, I'm going to also set an error. And I'm going to put a little comment here, just reinforcing the fact that you might not get this name depending on the social media that you're using. But again, you're going to have to create a complicated check system if you're going to be using different social media provider types. So you can just go ahead and set there, just say the identity provider doesn't have a username, and we'll know what that means. And then at the end, in the last catch block or in the last else block, you can say the identity provider is missing a lot of necessary information. Please try another account or another provider. Set the authenticating to false like you've been doing. And then let's add a catch block. And we're going to pass the error props in. We're going to set the authenticating to false here as well, and set the error to the error.message. And until we actually create the backend function in the next video, this should be enough for now. So inside of the login page, we're just going to create a little form here. What we're going to do is we're actually going to use that centerpiece object we created already. And inside of that, we're going to pass in a card. Inside of that, we're going to have a card header and a card body. Inside of the card header, I'm going to check to see if isLogin is equal to true, meaning that this is the login page, not the register page. And if so, I'm just going to have the text here say something like login or login page. And if not, it's going to say sign up or register. So essentially we have one page serving two purposes. Now, inside of our components, let's go ahead and create one more component called error text. This is just going to be a simple component that will render some error text for us if there's a problem with authenticating with the backend or any backend function. The props are going to have an error that's a string, and this function component is going to be very simple. You're going to pass in the props into the chevrons. You're going to have the const error is equal to the props, just so we can access the variable cleanly. And we're going to check to say if there is an error and it's equal to an empty space, we're just going to return null, because that means there actually is no error. But if there is an error, we're going to return just some small text, give it the class name text danger so it appears as red, and then we're going to pass in the actual error itself. And then we're going to export the default error text, and now we have this function. Let's go ahead and copy and paste this too, because we're actually going to create one more component called success text, and it's essentially going to be the same thing, except inside of this file, we're going to replace all of the error text with success text. We're going to change the error string to just say the word success. And once we do that, we're going to change that text danger to a text success so it appears as green. Now we have components to render these for us cleanly. So you can go ahead and pass that into the card body. And this won't render if there isn't an error, because it's just going to return null. But if there is an error, it's going to pop up at the top of the body for us. Now we're going to pass in a button. And this button is going to be our sign in with social media button. It's going to be a block. It's going to be disabled if we are authenticating, so you don't click it twice. On click, we're going to call our our sign in with social media function. We're going to pass in the providers.google. And it should be noted that providers.google is being passed into us from the definition we gave it inside of our Firebase file. So providers.google comes from our Firebase import. The style is going to be having a background color, and this is the hexadecimal for Google. Now inside of this button, we're also going to do that check to see if we're logging in or signing up. And what we're going to do here is we're also going to import the Google icon from Font Awesome, since we've already put that in a previous video. So I'm just going to click and copy this. I'm going to paste that in here, change the class to a class name. Give it a little margin so it has some space between the text, and then have our check say sign up or sign in. Something really simple like this. Now I'm going to check to see if we are authenticating, and if we are, I'm going to add the loading component. I'm going to say the card is equal to false because we're already inside of a card, and keep it nice and simple like this. So let's go ahead and fire this up and see what happens. We're going to run an npm start. You can see here that it's checking local storage first. It finds that there's no credentials found, and then it puts us onto the login page that we wanted. And since we have /login, it's giving us the sign in with Google. So let's go ahead and take a look at the console here. So if I click this sign in with Google button, let's see what happens. You can see that it passed me this object because I'm already signed in with Google on this browser, and it's giving me a token. It's giving me all this cool stuff. So the Google credentials are working. So our next step now is going to be creating a backend function to take this token and verify it so the backend can say that yes, they are the user they claim to be. And once we authenticate with the backend, then we're going to return some user information and complete the sign-in process. All right, guys, thanks so much for tuning into this one, and we'll see you in part 5.